I want to welcome everyone to our meeting this morning. The purpose of our meeting is the FOIA training. And at this time, I would ask our Vice Chair, Ms. Denise Tynes, to lead us in the pledge and the moment of silence.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Okay, we are down to the business part of our agenda, and the business part for today is the training on the Freedom of Information Act. And at this time, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Ms. Ewing.
Thank you. And the first thing we need to do, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint that I'm going to be talking about today. So bear with me for just a second as I get that going. Okay, can everybody see a slide that says Isle of Wight Board Development?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Okay. First thing I want to do is introduce myself, and then I'm going to go around and ask each of you to introduce yourselves. I'm Elizabeth Ewing. I've spoken with and or met many of you back in the good old days when we could do things face to face. I'm the Director of Legal and Policy Services at the SBA. Those are actually two different things. Legal services is one thing, policy services is another, but there's an awful lot of overlap between the two of those. So usually I run both of them together. But a big part of my job is talking to board members, superintendents, and clerks, and various other people about a lot of topics that impact schools. I was kind of surprised when I came to this job, which was almost exactly 20 years ago. I've been at the VSBA 20 years this month. I was surprised how much of my job does deal with the Freedom of Information Act. And it seems to be an increasing percentage. We get lots and lots and lots of questions about various topics under the Freedom of Information Act. And so I'm always happy when a board does what you're doing, reaching out to learn more about it. I'm always happy to have one-on-one conversations, but sometimes it's more efficient to do things as a group. So I am glad that we are doing this morning. And I'm going to ask everybody who is on camera to introduce yourselves. You all know each other, but so that I'll get an idea. I know who the board members are, but if everybody would go around and introduce themselves, I would appreciate it.
Okay, we'll start with, we'll go around with Vicki. Go around this way. Okay, Vicki?
Hi, I'm Vicki Hulick. I'm the board member for the Carrollton District. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say about myself. So,
I'm Julie Perkins, and I'm the board member for the Windsor District.
I'm Alvin Wilson. I'm the board member for the Hardy District, all of Wight County.
Good morning. I'm Jackie Carr. I am the chair currently, and I represent the Carsville District.
Good morning. My name is Denise Tynes, and I'm the vice chair, and I represent the Smithfield District.
Good morning. Michael Lombardo. I serve as Assistant Superintendent for Isle of Wight County Schools.
I'm Jessica Whitlow, and I'm the Deputy School Board Clerk. My name is Tracy Ruitt, and I am the School Board Clerk.
I'm Lynn Briggs. I'm Director of Community and Media Relations.
I think that's it right now.
Okay, great. Thank you all. And thank you for being here. Lynn, I think I know you're the FOIA officer, right? This is Vision. So great. Good to know. And I'm glad you could be in on this today. When we were setting this up, I had a conversation with your superintendent, and I'm sorry he can't be here today. But he let me know a couple of the things that you all want to talk about. He said that your primary points of interest were motions for going into closed session and access to public records. He also mentioned that there was an interest in increasing transparency. And he and I didn't really get into the details of that. He didn't tell me what aspects of transparency you all were interested in increasing or any more details of that. So he had indicated that these topics came up from talking with board members. So I'm hoping that whichever board member or members mentioned that you were interested in increasing transparency generally might give me a little more information. If anybody remembers saying that and can tell me what aspects of transparency you're interested in, I'd love to hear it. I'm going to kind of weave in transparency throughout the presentation or the session generally. But if you want to tell me what aspects of transparency you're particularly interested in, I'll be happy to kind of keep that in mind as I go along.
Well, I think today's topics, being closed session and access to public records, are certainly our main topics that we want to focus on. As we go through, I would ask that if we have any questions during the presentation, if we can ask at that time.
Definitely, yes.
And one thing I want to just add is that we want to be as transparent as we can be on everything. We don't want to hide anything.
Okay. Good to know. I'm not surprised. Most, very few boards ever say they want to hide anything, but it's nice to hear it articulated. So thank you. And definitely, yes, this is a good-sized group. It's interesting. Actually, the Zoom software is showing me that every one of you is muted, and I think that's just a factor of the way it's set up to keep the feedback from getting obnoxious, because it seems like I can hear all of you. So yes, feel free to speak up and ask questions as we go along. I want this to be helpful for you all as possible, and answering questions is one of the best ways to do that. A couple of other things I want to mention from my conversation with your superintendent. He said that someone had asked why the SBA was offering FOIA training now. And it's a combination of things. We had, I think you all probably remember that VSBA had talked to Wight back in the fall, I'm not sure exactly when, about doing a session like this. And at the time, the SBA was not offering FOIA training as one of our board development sessions. But it was interesting because within a week of the time you guys first inquired about it, another school board also asked if we would do some FOIA training for them. So obviously that got our attention when we got two very similar requests within a week of each other. And we've had other requests too. This is the first one we have done, but scheduled for next week. So I think VSBA to our list of offerings when our members are interested in that. And so that this was a pretty clear indication that our members are interested in more FOIA training. And so that's the answer to that specific question. But the logical follow-up question to that is, boards more interested in it now than maybe they have been in the past. And I think that there are several reasons for that, too. I'll start with the new law that went into effect last July 1st, so 8 months ago, requiring training for all elected public officials, not just school board members, all elected public officials have to get FOIA training now. FOIA officers, Lynn, were required to get FOIA training earlier than that, so I'm sure you had your initial training a while ago, probably. But what the law requires, I'm sure you all know this, is every elected board member is required to get FOIA training from either the FOIA Council or your own school board attorney at least once every 2 years. So, and the deadline for people who were in office last July 1st, when the law went into effect, had passed. So I know you all have already received that training, but what we've been kind of seeing anecdotally is that as boards get that training, they realize they have more questions. They need some follow-up on that training. So I think that kind of factors into it too. Another kind of angle of it is we are seeing increasing activity in both the courts and the FOIA Council in the court litigation involving FOIA from the FOIA Council. They are busier than ever dealing with comments and complaints from the public and the media. So I think that FOIA is just becoming a hotter topic of interest among your communities, and that, of course, means you're interested too. So that's kind of why the SBA is doing this. Basically, we are seeing a need for it and seeing interest for it among our members. So we always try to be responsive when our members say they are interested in learning more about a particular topic. And like I said, you all are the first for this FOIA training, but I'm glad that you were interested and that we could get a date scheduled. Sometimes that's the hardest thing about board development sessions is getting the dates. Before I kind of get into the meat of the Freedom of Information Act, I want to just remind you of a couple of things. FOIA is what we call required reading for school board members. And there are actually 3 statutes. Sure, you have all seen my emails. I send them out a year shortly after the election, on the election cycle, shortly after elections take place, reminding you that FOIA, as well as the Conflict of Interest Act and the Public Records Act, are laws that every school board member is required to read and familiarize yourselves with. I always emphasize that the requirement is for you to read and familiarize yourself. It's not read and memorize. It's not read and understand every single word, which would be a very tall order. When I do the orientations for new school board members, I always suggest actually that they start with the Freedom of Information Act because I think it's the easiest reading of the 3. The Public Records Act is shorter, so for people who want to, do something and knock it off of the to-do list, and starting with the Public Records Act might make sense. The Conflict of Interest Act, FOIA looks like a piece of cake. It is dense. It is complicated. It's just difficult. So you are required to read and familiarize yourselves with all 3, and just for some perspective, Freedom of Information Act is probably the easiest of those 3. One thing I also want to mention with regard to the Public Records Act is that every division is required to have a records officer. I know in a lot of divisions, especially smaller divisions, that person is your superintendent. But if you ever have questions about things like the records retention periods and how long you are required to retain a particular document, or how documents are to be destroyed, there are classifications. Some have to be destroyed in a more secure manner than others. The person in your division who can answer those questions for you is your public records officer. And Lynn, I'll pick on you. Do you happen to be the lucky person to wear that hat too?
I did not get that one. Woo-woo.
Okay, good for you. Does everybody know who your public records officer is?
Tracy?
It's
Colleen Loud.
I thought you Tracy. Who was Colleen?
She's our coordinator.
Good.
Deals with student
I
records.
will tell you, sometimes I ask board members that and they don't have a clue who their records officer is.
Well, I didn't have a clue. I'm guilty.
Well,
thought it was Tracy.
you are not alone.
Let me write that down. Colleen.
Okay, I've actually already mentioned the training requirement as a factor leading towards this, but excuse me, I have fat thumbs and I frequently advance or to the sides before I really intend to. Just to remind you, the requirement is that each board member get the training at least once every 2 years. So depending on when you got your initial training, the 2-year period for each person may very well be different. I know some, at least initially, wanted to get the training together as a group, which was fine if you could work it out that way. But for a lot of boards, the logistics of that just didn't work. And the online option from the FOIA Council is a great option. So I know that's how a lot of people got that training. VSBA actually had Alan Gernhardt from the FOIA Council come in at a VSBA conference and do an initial training on to meet the legal requirement. We hope to have him again at some point, but Michaela, maybe you know, is he signed up, or anybody from the FOIA Council signed up for follow-up training?
I think this year it's COIA instead of FOIA.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Thanks. There's a similar requirement for COIA training, Conflict of Interest Act training, which you're also required to get at least once every 2 years. So what VSBA, and that requirement went into effect a year before the FOIA training requirement went into effect. So what VA is hoping to do is alternate to do COIA, a speaker from the Conflict of Interest, speaker on the Conflict of Interest Act, which is administered by the Ethics Council 1 year, and a speaker on FOIA the next year, and alternate as a way to at least keep our members, give them an option. We know that everybody won't be able to take advantage of that, but hopefully it will make the training available for a lot of people. I think you all know this, especially since Lynn is here. Every school board is required to designate and publicly identify at least one FOIA officer. Some of the larger divisions have more than one, but you have to have at least one, and obviously you do. And the name of your FOIA officer and contact information is required to be on your website. So I'm sure it is.
Is that you? Oh, we got Lynn. Okay, I figured out.
The FOIA officer's job is to serve as a point of contact for members of the public who are requesting records, and also to coordinate the school board's compliance with the Freedom of Information Act. So Lynn, I'm just curious, do you get a lot of records requests in IWCS? Do you get a lot of FOIA questions?
It varies. At times it seems like there are more requests than others.
That makes sense. Do you ever see situations where you get essentially the same request, either different people or different groups, that lets you know that there's a hot topic brewing that maybe you weren't aware of, or that the board wasn't aware of?
Yes.
That's what we hear from most divisions, is that sometimes they actually learn or have it really brought home to them that there's a particular issue that's of interest to your community from FOIA requests. So in addition to the public getting information from you, getting the public records, boards can also learn from their public just by what's being requested. Okay, those are the reminders, and what I'm going to do now is kind of turn to what I consider more the meat of the Freedom of Information Act. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about language in the Freedom of Information Act that's really kind of the introductory language that sets the background for the Freedom of Information Act. Not all laws have that kind of information, but FOIA does, and honestly, it's the kind of information or the parts of the law that I think a lot of people, if you're reading it for a read and familiarize type session, this is the kind of language that a lot of people tend to kind of skim over because it doesn't answer specific questions about motions or closed session topics or what records are exempt. So since everybody's always in a hurry and wants the answers to their questions, you kind of tend sometimes to skip over introductory language. But this language actually is important. And so I'm going to ask everybody to read what's up there and just recognize that the General Assembly not only enacted the parts of FOIA that have the exceptions and the rules, the General Assembly also thought it was important enough to put this background language into the Act so that it's a part of the law. And the purpose for that, or what that does, is announce both to public bodies, to school boards and all other public bodies, but also to the citizens, what FOIA is supposed to do and how it's supposed to work. And on the one hand, it's really pretty simple. The Freedom of Information Act is there to ensure the people of the Commonwealth have ready access to your public records and free entry to meetings of public bodies. And that really sounds kind of simple, almost kind of superficial, but it is the basis of the Freedom of Information Act, and it's the basis really of everything that a public body, whether it's a school board or board of supervisors or city council or anything else, does. And it's also important to remember this for another reason, namely that these are the principles that you will hear about in a court case or a FOIA opinion or from your media or members of your public who are interested in getting information. These are the parts of the Freedom of Information Act that members of the public tend to focus on. And especially this language towards the end of this, members of the public tend to remind you that they are the beneficiaries of any action taken by any governmental entity. And I know schools, sometimes school boards and school divisions, sometimes forget that they are governmental entities because you are so focused on the kids and instruction. And you don't think of yourselves as the governmental entity in the sense that maybe the General Assembly is or a court is. But obviously you are public servants, public officials, you are elected, and the school board clearly is a governmental entity. And everything you do benefits the public, not just the kids that you are educating. I think everybody knows that there are two big parts of the Freedom of Information Act. One part is the part that applies to meetings. The other part applies to public records. And as you have been reading and familiarizing yourselves with FOIA, you've probably noticed that there are parts of it that just don't make a whole lot of sense for how they apply to school boards. And that's true. You know, some of the exceptions, especially for meetings, are written very specifically to apply to named public statewide agencies. So as you're going through the list of exceptions, you can just skip over ones that are like with the Department of Forestry and things like that. But keep in mind that by and large, all of the Freedom of Information Act applies to school boards, and the general principles certainly do. Okay, remember, the starting point for FOIA is that all meetings are open to the public, they fall under a statutory exception, and the public body properly invokes that exception. So that's why I spent some time on those starting points. The general principle is always that everything you do is open to the public. And the second part of the sentence in front of you is just as important as the first. There's got to be, if you want to go into closed session, the law has to permit it, and you have to properly invoke the law. Currently, I think there are just about 50 reasons, maybe 48 reasons that you can go into closed session. A lot of them you will never have reason to deal with. And again, part of that is because some of them are named public agencies that just are not school boards. But a lot of them are invoked on a pretty regular basis by school divisions. And I'm going to come back to closed sessions a little bit later, but I just wanted to set the stage to remind you that all meetings are open, that is the general principle, and if you're going into closed session, it's an exception, and exceptions are always construed narrowly. So if you want to use an exception, you have to be completely sure that you are invoking that exception properly, and that whatever the topic is that you're going to talk about is permitted by law to be discussed in closed session. I don't know if any of you are lawyers or people who like to actually look at the law for yourselves. I know a lot of people do. I'm one of those people. I always want to go to the original source. So I have put some citations in this presentation for you, so you have those if you want to see it. And this is the section of the law, that says that if you're going to go into closed session, you have to exercise exemption. And this is the corresponding language that talks about public records. Okay, so I've talked about meetings being open to the public, but I want to talk a little bit more about exactly what is a meeting. And the Freedom of Information Act defines a meeting for four purposes as a gathering of 3 or more members, or a quorum, if a quorum is less than 3, of a public body at which the public business, the business of that public body, is discussed or transacted. Now, there's only one school board in Virginia where a quorum is less than 3, so that is something you guys don't have to worry about, at least as far as the board goes. There is one board that only has 3 members, so for them a quorum is 2. But there's 5 of you, so a quorum is 3. That's an easy number to deal with. The critical part of deciding whether any gathering is a meeting for FOIA purposes is the last 3 words of this statute, and that is discussed or transacted. I always try to get board members and clerks and superintendents to focus on that when they are trying to decide if any particular event or gathering is a meeting for FOIA purposes. And the bottom line is always whether the board members are going to be discussing or transacting school board business. And you can kind of whittle that down a little bit more, because the transacting part means essentially voting. That's how boards transact the public business, is you take a vote. And, nobody ever takes a vote in the produce aisle at the grocery store or at a football game, I hope. So I don't get too many questions or have too many situations where somebody thinks something might have been a meeting because they voted outside of a traditional meeting. But the discussing part does get a lot more interest, and you get a lot more questions about that. And one way I try to get people to look at this is by by not focusing on the title that's given to any particular gathering. For example, today, Taylor and I were working with Tracy and your superintendent to set this up. We refer this to it as board development or a training session. I'm not sure how you guys were referring to it internally. We do that because that's what we're focusing on. And boards have a lot of different names or titles that they give to typical, the types of meetings that they might typically have. Don't focus on the name. You can call something a work session or a retreat, and that's fine because that gives more information about what you plan to do at that gathering, but that doesn't mean it's not a meeting for FOIA purposes. And work sessions, the term work sessions, is actually in FOIA now. It didn't used to be. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, public bodies, I don't think particularly school boards, but some public bodies would have things that they called work sessions so that, or apparently so that, they didn't have to follow the meetings rules. They didn't have to give notice and to do all the things that go along with being a meeting. And the General Assembly caught on to that pretty quickly. And so now the definition of meetings in the Act specifically includes work sessions. So every once in a while I'll talk to a board member who has been on the board for a long, long time, and they'll say, well, but it was a work session, it wasn't a meeting. And I remind them that work sessions are meetings, which makes sense because you are discussing school board business at work sessions. A lot of boards don't take votes at work sessions, and that is the criteria for them, the difference between a work session and a meeting, or I should say a regular meeting. And that's fine, but it's still a meeting for FOIA purposes. Another thing that some public bodies, and again, I don't think school boards were the driving force, but at one point, at least a couple of public bodies had meetings outside of their jurisdiction. So they might go to another part of the state. One appropriating body actually went out of state and somehow thought that they were going to avoid the Freedom of Information Act by having their meeting elsewhere. Doesn't matter. They were still discussing school board business, so it was still a meeting, and would be if they do that now. Conference calls also, just as a reminder, it comes from our type of gathering. So if you are on a conference call or a Zoom meeting or a meeting or any of the various technological ways you can get together now, or that people can get together now, if three or more of you are discussing school board business, that is a meeting for FOIA purposes. What's not a meeting are some examples of things that are not meetings for FOIA purposes are staff meetings, because board members aren't there, and the board is the public body. Also, meetings between a board member and the superintendent. Those two individuals might well be discussing school board business, but there aren't three or more board members there. And the board members, obviously, since there's not more than one, not going to be discussing school board business. If you, as a board member, are discussing school-related things with one of your constituents, that's not a meeting for school board for FOIA purposes. I'm going to get into electronic communication meetings because it's a much hotter topic now than it was a year ago. But before I do that, anybody got any questions on meetings generally?
So as long as we meet with the superintendent, only two of us meet with him, that is not considered a meeting, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Now, is that y'all's regular practice?
On occasion.
Upon occasion.
Okay, but yeah. Yep. That is not a meeting. Any other kind of general meeting questions?
If we're at an event, and there's more than 3 of us there, but we're not voting and we're not really talking about school board business, that's not considered a meeting either, right? That, I'm just clarifying.
That is true, but I'm going to get you to give me a little more information. You said we're not really discussing school board business?
Like, no, like we're talking about like our families or, you know, stuff like that. Or maybe we're talking about dates and times of something, but not talking about actual school board information.
Okay, well, if you're talking about your family, clearly not. I mean, unless you're talking about, you know, whether your children are having problems with their teachers. And that could be school board business.
Okay.
If you're talking about, can you give me an example of dates and times?
Like if we say that, oh, the board meeting is Wednesday at 8 p.m., you know, or, I mean, that's
And
not.
it's going to be at Smithfield High
Right.
School instead of the West Side Cafeteria.
Yeah, like that.
You know, that technically is probably not school board business, but if you are discussing it in the sense that you are making a decision whether you're going to move the meeting or change the start time, that could be.
Okay, so, but if you're just confirming the time and date, that would not be.
If you're saying something like, here that the meeting has time and place have been moved, that would probably not be.
Okay.
It's also an area you want to be really careful about because it's so easy to slide from that conversation or that statement into a bigger conversation. For example, say the meeting is noticed for 7 p.m., 7 to 9, and there's a long agenda, and you might say, yeah, we're starting at 7, but I have no idea how we're going to get all the things that are on the agenda in. I don't know how we're going to talk about all of those. That can very quickly kind of snowball into the type of substantive conversation that can become a meeting.
So if it was a one-on-one conversation, that would be fine, but if there's 3 of us there, that's when there's a problem, correct?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I'm sorry. If it was a one-on-one conversation, that's fine, because it's not a meeting, because there's only 2 people involved.
Right.
But if it's more than 3 people there, that's when the issues arise.
It's 3 or more.
Right. Well, yes. Okay.
Yes, it's not more than 3 or more.
Okay, got it.
Madam Chair, may I ask a question? So, Ms. Ewing, what about when the board is attending like a VSBA training, or we have convocation where all board members are there for introduction purposes?
Okay, you tell me. Are they there? Are they discussing school board business?
No, they would just be there, you know, as an introduction to the new staff members and things like that.
Potted plant.
So, but that includes the training that they go to VSBA? They're just receiving information?
Let's take them one at a time. If they are at some event where they are just introduced and they are not going to talk to each other, then that's not a meeting. Now, what a lot of boards will do is give notice of that so that your public, your community knows board members are going to be there. They can see that you as elected officials are out there representing them and the school division at whatever function that is. And you certainly do that, but just keep in mind, are you giving notice because you want to be a little more transparent than you absolutely are required to be? And let people know that your board members are gathering at, you know, whatever place and time that is. That is not the same as giving notice of something because FOIA requires it. So you can certainly give notice of those types of things if the board wants that to be done. The kind of second variation that you mentioned, like the VSBA annual convention back in the day when, and hopefully in when we get to do that live again, if your board members are all attending and they're going to be discussing your school board business, then they would be having a meeting in Williamsburg. And only the board members know what they're going to be doing. There are some boards where what we see is that their board members, individual board members, honestly have nothing to talk about other than school board business. They don't make casual chit chat. They don't ask how their spouses and children are doing. If they are together, all they're going to talk about is school board business. So in a division where that is kind of the norm, they would give notice anytime 3 or more of the board members are going to be together, give FOIA notice. Other boards are so comfortable with the fact that they know that if 3 or more of them, are together, they cannot discuss school board business, that they kind of immediately go into what I call the social chit-chat mode. And they talk about, pro sports or the weather, but not weather related to school closings, things like that. And I don't know the personalities on this board. I don't know whether you guys do the casual chit chat thing or not. And either way is fine. And some divisions, I know you didn't ask this, but I'll tell you, some divisions do give notice when 3 or more of their members are going to the VSBA annual convention, just to cover the situation and give the board members the option of being able to discuss school board business while they're there, if they want to. Does that help at all?
I think so, yeah.
That helped. Mrs. Ewan, I just wanted to give you a situation that we had about.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, we had a situation, I guess about a month or so ago, and the situation was, I'm sure you've probably heard about it, we had a court case. All of the board members had attended court that particular day, and we were went out for lunch. Well, we all split and went in opposite directions because I heard someone say, well, we all can't go at the same time. And well, a couple of us, 2 of the board members, Mr. Wilson and myself, we went with the superintendent and had lunch. The others, I guess, went in opposite directions. I'm understanding you to say that would have been a situation that we all could have gone out and sat down for lunch together, providing we did not discuss anything about school business.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
However, you've got to remember what it's going to look like to your public.
To the public, that's it. Because we were all going to be in a restaurant together. They're going to say we're having a meeting. But as long as we...
No. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But I was just... And it's kind of hard...
If you're in a restaurant, probably everybody can eavesdrop on what you're hearing, what you're saying, and they would know whether you were discussing school board business or not.
Right.
But especially if you're coming out of a court case, that obviously, if you all were there, and I don't happen to know anything else about that situation, but if the board is in court because of a court case involving division-related business, obviously that's going to be on your mind, and that's going to be on the minds of your public. So I can see that suspicions might have been high that was going to be the topic of conversation. Eavesdropping is not good, but I grew up in a small town. I know how small towns work, and I also know how the restaurants across from the courthouse work. And so I think people might have, community might have made assumptions that that's what you were going to be talking about.
Well, the judge had directed us not to discuss anything about the case situation itself. And of course, we weren't going to discuss that. And I guess I can control myself from talking about school business if I'm with the others in a room. I don't have to do that. I can talk about pleasure things, but you know.
It's easier sometimes to go your own way.
Not surprised to hear that. There are board members in other parts of the state who can't control themselves. And recognize whether they can or cannot. And if somebody knows that they can't, that, you know, they are just so interested in whatever the topic of the day is that they're going to want to talk about it, then the way to avoid getting into FOIA trouble is keep yourself out of the situation.
I'd like to talk about.
Thank you.
So the key to the whole
Sure.
thing
And-
is what
Go
the
ahead.
appearance is, and you don't want to put yourself in a position where the appearance can be misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I mean, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
All right.
Anybody else that got any general meeting questions?
No, ma'am, we're ready to move on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, electronic meetings. This is something that what I'm going to say has changed, would have been entirely different a year ago. But the pandemic has changed lots of things, including topics for FOIA training. The general rule is that when public bodies meet, you meet face-to-face. There are a couple of exceptions, and for years, FOIA has recognized two exceptions, one of which never came into play until the pandemic. So the first exception is when the board or a quorum of the board is gathered together face-to-face. And an individual board member, or in y'all's case two, since if a quorum is gathered, that's going to be three, two others could call in. Doesn't actually have to be a call, could be Zoom technology, but most people do it by a call, so that's the only reason I'm saying call in. And that individual board member or maybe two members participates electronically. The other situation is where the board, the entire board meets, each board member is in a separate location, and the entire meeting is virtual. Have you guys done any of those?
No.
Did you meeting face-to-face throughout the pandemic? Okay. All right, good to know. Then I will not give you too much detail on that. Have you had any meetings where individual board members participate remotely?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Then I will go over that at least a little bit. First thing you have to do, and you have done it, I checked your online policy manual. If you're going to have people participate remotely, you have to adopt a policy permitting that.
Can we do that?
Right one, you guys adopted it.
West
It's
side?
there. You're good. It's policy BDD, and y'all's version is pretty much exactly the same as the VSBA version. That policy kind of, it has all of the details that you need if and when you've got a board member who wants or needs to participate electronically. What I always tell people is don't try to remember all of the details unless your memory is a whole lot better than mine. But remember, you've got the policy and all of the details are there. Probably the thing I get the most questions on is the reasons why people participate remotely. And they can participate, individual board members can participate remotely for two separate reasons. One is because of a disability or medical condition. The other is for a personal reason. And it's important, it's critical for the board member who wants to participate remotely to identify which of those two reasons they are invoking. And that is because board members are limited to participating twice per calendar year, participating remotely twice per calendar year for personal reasons. Participate remotely for an unlimited number of meetings for a disability or medical condition. But if you are participating remotely because of a personal reason, you can only do it twice per year. So you have to identify if it's a personal reason or a medical reason so that Tracy and the other people can keep track of whether you have met your quota or exceeded your quota on that. Also, if a board member is seeking to participate remotely for a personal reason, they have to identify that personal reason with specificity. And that has to be reflected in the minutes of the meeting. So just keep in mind that the rules are somewhat different depending on whether you are participating remotely for personal reasons or for medical reasons.
All right, I have a question right there. So if there was a board member who had or requested to participate electronically because of personal reasons, and they did that twice, but then they have a medical reason for the third time, does that count as, no, we can't do it because you've already had your two, or is it both?
Over 4?
They could, if they've used up their two for personal reasons and they get sick or whatever, get disabled, they can then participate remotely for the medical reasons an unlimited amount of time.
Medical reasons, an unlimited amount of times? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
The first situation I was aware of that a board had a school board member who used the medical condition exception was a school board member who had multiple sclerosis. And I don't know if you know much about that disease, but this particular person had good spells and bad spells. And when they were doing well, they could get to meetings. When the disease was flaring up, they couldn't. They simply could not get there. And so that person, I think, probably participated remotely, probably half of the meetings in a particular year. And that's what the law permits. That's kind of the classic situation of what this was put into place for. So, certainly I hope none of you find yourself in that kind of situation, but it's an option that permits you to keep doing your job. And obviously there are some medical situations where a board member can't. At some point the medical condition might take over. But the people who elected you can still see that you are fulfilling your responsibilities if you can do that. So I think the rationale between the law is personal conditions or personal reasons come up more rarely, and it's more logical to expect elected officials to be at meetings in person. The personal reasons come up and they happen. Medical conditions, you can't do anything about them. Nobody wants them. It's personal conditions or personal reasons. Maybe it's your 50th wedding anniversary and the trip of your lifetime, and it's a once in a lifetime thing, and everybody understands that. But it's only going to happen twice. You can only miss a meeting twice a year. Medical conditions, nobody wants anybody to be in that situation. And if you keep fulfilling your responsibilities by participating remotely, that is good for the public body and it's good for the people who elected the individuals. Any more questions on that aspect of it? Okay. The logistics of how that works is if somebody needs to or wants to participate remotely, they let the chair know on or before the day of the meeting that that's what they want to do, and they let you know whether for a personal reason or a medical condition. The board actually has to vote to permit the person to participate remotely. And so obviously that's a vote like anything else. there was some interesting language added to FOIA a couple of years ago that says something along the lines of when the board votes, it can't base its vote on the identity of the board member or the issues that are on the agenda for that board meeting. And that language just honestly didn't make much sense to me. So I called Alan Bernhardt at FOIA Council and I said, where did this come from? What's it trying to address? And he told me that there had been a situation, it was not involving the school board, it was another type of local government entity, where a board member wanted to participate remotely, and the other board members knew how, well, they were pretty sure how he was going to vote on a very contentious issue that was going to be decided that night. And so they did not let him participate remotely because they didn't want his votes to count. And I got to say, you know, I've seen a lot of politics in my life, but that really surprised me. And that's where that language came from. I've never heard of a school board doing anything like that. But if you think it's odd that the board has to vote to approve this, just keep in mind that some boards, not necessarily school boards, do some crazy things sometimes. And so that's where some of the law comes from.
That actually happened to me, Mrs. Ewing, not with the school board, but with another group that I was with, governmental group I was with. It happened to me.
Okay. I did not know that. The situation that Alan told me about was the Board of Supervisors. So, but I can't say I'm glad to hear it, but I'm glad you told us about it, just so everybody will know that I'm not making stuff up. I'm sorry that it happened to you.
It's just citizens hurt.
If and when you've got a situation where the somebody is participating remotely, the minutes have to reflect where the board member was participating from. So, you know, it's a detail, but just remember that has to be in there. And like I said, the minutes have to also reflect whether it was a medical condition or a personal matter, so that one of the reasons is so that everybody can keep track of where people stand on how many meetings they've missed or personal matters. Okay, I know you said you guys have not done any of these, and I hope that, you know, the pandemic is passing and nobody needs to do this going forward. But I am going to talk about it just a little bit, just because so many other boards are having these kinds of meetings, and in case you're interested in how they're doing it and what they're doing.
Page are we on, Vicky?
Huh?
Page are we on?
She's like power going through here. Hold on.
Sorry, I was going the wrong way.
Okay.
He was moving backwards for a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. This one
Okay.
is the FOIA code.
Right now, there are actually a couple of sources of legal authority for completely virtual meetings.
Okay.
We are hoping that is going to change with this year's General Assembly that is in session right now. FOIA has always provided for entirely virtual meetings when the governor has declared an emergency, state of emergency. Until the pandemic, nobody had ever used that provision, and people actually tended to think of it as something that would come into play for hurricanes or that type of natural disaster. That's kind of what the law, that provision of the law was written for, and because of that, when the pandemic hit and this particular declaration of emergency went into effect, that's why there was some scrambling going on among school boards and all governmental entities to figure out how they could meet under the law and do what they needed to do. And that was kind of problematic because the language in FOIA permits boards to meet pursuant to a declaration of emergency to discuss the emergency, which is great. And in a hurricane, that's pretty much all you need to do because it passes pretty quickly. In the pandemic, however, people realized pretty soon that it was going to go on, or the interference with meeting face-to-face was going to go on much longer than a few days, which is what you would expect in a hurricane. And you needed to discuss a lot more than just the impact of the emergency. People still needed to get paid. You needed to figure out how to educate kids, all that kind of stuff that's not directly related to the pandemic. And so that's why some boards were scrambling to figure out exactly what they could do at a completely remote meeting. And back in March, the Attorney General actually issued an opinion that interpreted FOIA to permit boards to do essentially anything that they were statutorily required to do. So for the board paying your employees, paying the bills, those kind of things. The Attorney General's opinion kind of bridged the gap until the law could be changed via these two amendments. They were amendments to the budget bill. That's why I'm referring to them as amendments. They weren't amendments to FOIA, they were amendments to the budget bill. And they also provided for a somewhat expanded scope of things that could be discussed at virtual board meetings. They were in the budget bill, and the way budget bills work is that stuff in the budget bill is in place for that budget cycle. So if it's in the budget bill, it relates to the budget. But there are amendments proposed to the Freedom of Information Act in this session that, if they pass, will put all the law back in one place in FOIA, which will be nice from a logistic perspective. It's just easier to go to one place to find all the law on a particular topic than to have to go to lots of places. And there are a couple of things to keep in mind for entirely virtual meetings. If a board decides to use that authority, you still have to give notice by best means available. Again, if these were written for hurricane situations when the power might have been out, that hasn't been the situation in the pandemic. But you do have to give notice via the best available means, and you have to make arrangements for the public to participate through electronic means. You also have to make a recording or transcript of the meeting available on your website. And I think that's one that, because you are not required to make recordings or transcripts of meetings, face-to-face meetings available on your website, even though a fair number of boards do, but you're not required to. But if you do ever decide to use this entirely virtual option, you are required by law to make a recording or transcript available on your website.
Okay, I've got a question. It says, one of the bullets says that the means of communication, if the means, wait a minute, do we have to allow public the opportunity to comment during those meetings?
If the means of communication allows. And so that's going to depend on what means you use. Zoom, and Michaela, I'm sure, just don't laugh because she can confirm this for you. I am not technologically savvy, but But even I know that there are differences between how Zoom works and GoToMeeting works and other, the other systems that you might use. So I think most of them would support public comment, but I don't know enough about all of them to say for sure that they definitely do. And that might be one thing that if your board ever wants or needs to use this, it might be something to factor in to deciding which platform you're going to use. If you want, and obviously during the pandemic, public comment has been robust, and you probably want to encourage that. So you might choose a platform that you know makes that easier than another platform. And again, I can't talk details here, but I'm sure your tech people probably
But when you say public comment, are you talking about like the public comment we do at the regular business meetings?
As opposed to what?
As opposed to like on Facebook and they just sit there and comment on everything that's being said?
Oh, no, I'm talking more like live public comment, like
Okay.
you come to a
I was going to
meeting.
say, because just allowing for public to comment on everything that's being done, we don't even do that in the physical meetings.
Right.
Yeah, okay, I understand.
Yes, okay.
Madam Chair, we have in the past, though, in a situation like that, asked the citizens if they wanted to email in comments to be read. So that would be one scenario that we could offer public comments, that way their comments would be read at the electronic meeting.
During the regular time for public
Exactly.
comments?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. We've done that.
Thank you, Tracy.
So y'all have done electronic meetings?
No.
All right.
No, but for some reason, because of weather, if the public couldn't really get to the meetings, we offered them
Okay.
the opportunity to email in their comments, and they would be read at the meeting. But it wasn't open. It was an in-person meeting.
But it was done during the pandemic,
Yes.
Because we were restricted as to how many could come into the meeting. So they were offered the opportunity to email in any comment that they wanted to be presented at the school board meeting, and then it was read at our school board meeting.
Okay, yeah. And I've seen boards do that in some interesting ways. I just thought it was great that they had figured out what worked in their communities. And I'm just curious, when you say their comments were read, who read them? Tracy, did you read them, or did board members? Or
The school board
did it-
clerk, Tracy did.
Yeah, I was watching one school board meeting that it was entirely virtual, but what they did was and they had a lot of public comments come in that way, and they just took turns. Each board member would read, I think they were mainly had come in by email. Each board member would take turns reading a particular email, and they also, this was a big division, they also apparently had software, because when, I think their limit was 2 minutes per speaker, if it took more, if they got to the 2 minute point, then the sound just cut off. So I had been curious how they were going to do that to keep things consistent. Some people, you can say a lot in an email that's going to take 2 minutes to read, but if you tend to kind of ramble and not have things thought, it could take 5 minutes to read your email. And I had been curious to see how that particular division was going to handle that, to make sure that different speakers or writers, members of the public, were all treated consistently. And they had the software to do it. If you don't have software, and I would imagine most people don't, somebody's still going to have to keep the stopwatch or however you do it. But yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all that in that situation, that's kind of accommodated the interests of people who wanted to participate, but didn't want to be in a room with a whole lot of people. You know? So that sounds like a good solution for everybody. And was your public happy with that?
We didn't get any complaints.
Okay, that's close enough. Yeah.
We should have got a rah-rah, hey.
Yeah. But you have to be happy with no complaints.
That's right.
Sure.
I'll take it.
Okay. More generally, back to meetings, however, you know, whether they're live and in person or partially live and partially with some electronic participation. I think everybody already knows that once you are in a meeting, votes can only be taken in a meeting. They can't be taken, you know, in the parking lot ahead of time or after or anything like that. And votes also cannot be taken by a secret or a written ballot. The public has to see how each individual board member is voting. That's pretty basic to democracy. I want to talk briefly about the notice requirements for meetings. And when I talk about this at the orientation, the last time I did, I got some follow-up questions that made me realize that the people in the audience, well, let me say it this way. I should have made sure everybody knew the difference between regular meetings and special meetings before I jumped into talking about the difference for the notice requirements. So, just to make sure everybody is starting at the same point, regular meetings are the meetings that a board has, you know, and it varies, but say on the second Tuesday of the month, the ones that you set up at the beginning of the year at your organizational meeting, saying, here's our regular meeting schedule. And special meetings basically are anything else. Anything that comes up on short notice that the board needs to meet about. And the difference in those meetings, in the requirements for notice for those meetings, are just a logical reflection of the different types of meetings. Your regular meetings you know about well in advance and you can give a fair amount of notice. Special meetings, by definition, the need for them comes up kind of quickly, kind of on short notice, and so you may not have as much time to get the notice out. And I should say that the notice is always given. The nuts and bolts part of giving the notice is handled by staff, not by school board members. Nobody's expecting a board member to, you know, post something on your website or get the notice to your local newspaper, anything like that. But I want to talk about it because I think board members sometimes be approached, well, they'll tell me that they have been approached by members of the community or the media who say, you didn't give out a notice. And whoever's saying that is always upset about something else, but they try to turn it into a FOIA issue. So I just like board members to be confident that they know what notice is required so that if somebody does come up to you and say you did it wrong, you're confident enough to say, no, this is what was required and this is what we did. So for regular meetings, you have to be given at least 3 working days before the meeting. And like I said, staff people will take care of actually doing it, but the requirement is 3 working days before the meeting. Sorry about that. I've heard that there are some divisions in the state that make it a practice of giving more than 3 days notice. Does your board give 3 days notice or do you give more than that?
For the
Regular meetings? Are you talking regular?
Yes, regular meetings.
Yeah, we give more than 3 days notice. They're posted.
Yeah, they're posted on our website
For the entire year.
for the entire year, once it's approved.
Okay. Yes. Okay. And that's great, but just remember the law only requires 3 working days. So I mean, more is always better, but if for some reason you have to change something, what the law requires is 3 working days. Where is notice given? And again, Tracy, are you the one who actually does this?
Well, it's Lynn,
Tracy, or
it's Lynn and I in combination.
Okay.
Lynn does post it to the website. She also sends it to the newspaper. I post it in the clerk's office. She also does Twitter and Facebook, you know, things like that.
Gotcha. Okay. So it sounds like y'all are pretty on top of where the notice has to be given. It's your website, public location at which notices are regularly posted. That provision has been in the law for a long time, dating back to the day when public notices were routinely mailed to the courthouse door. That worked. It's kind of old-fashioned. I don't really need that anymore, and it sounds like y'all are actually going further than the law requires, which is great, especially and also responsive to just the modern world to put things on Facebook and social media.
Lynn, do we do a prominent public location? I know we do the clerk's office. Where else?
That's what I'm saying with the newspaper and
Oh,
then,
the newspaper.
And it's in the lobby of our school board
Right.
office. And
Website.
Then, Facebook, Twitter, website.
What used to be our public location? I mean, was there a public location that we used to do it at?
I think it was posted out
At
here.
the county office here.
You know, there's that little like window with
bulletin board
announcements.
out front.
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense. I bet that bulletin board out front of the county office building was probably full of notices like this. Back in the day when that's where people.
Yeah, before technology took over.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, special meetings, the ones that tend to come up, or the need for which tend to come up on shorter notice. The notice for those, the requirement is that notice for those has to be reasonable under the circumstances. And people sometimes look at me and say, what does that mean? How many days? And there's no answer to that. It's reasonable under the circumstances. And the circumstances vary greatly. I've talked to boards who have had something happen that they need to have a meeting 3 or 4 hours later, and they can manage to get board members together on that short a notice. In that case, obviously you're not going to be able to get notice in the newspaper, at least in the printed version. Some newspapers have an online public notices section that they might be able to update that short a notice, but so it really is whatever is reasonable under the circumstances. You do what you can, you get the best notice out there possible, and that's what the law requires. The other aspect of this is that you have to give notice to the public at the same time you give it to the board members. So basically, as soon as you figure out that you've got a quorum who can meet at, whatever date and time you're going to meet, you give the public notice. Anybody, Tracy, I'm on you. I'll pick on clerks generally, but clerks are great at their jobs because they are so detail-oriented and they follow rules. And this rule seems to be a little too vague for a lot of clerks. And I think by extension for a lot of members of the public who think, well, that means 2 days or 1 day or something. And that's not what the law says. It's reasonable under the circumstances. So you figure out what the circumstances are and you do the best you can. Get it out to as broadly as possible. I just want to mention this quickly. It's an exception to the notice requirements rule, and it only comes into play when boards are interviewing potential superintendents. So a lot of board members serve their entire tenure on the board and never have this come into play. But if it ever does, call me or take a look at this provision in the law. What it says is that basically you can give notice at an open meeting. You have to to be in an open meeting, you can announce at that meeting that there will be a closed meeting at an either disclosed or undisclosed, your choice, location within 15 days thereafter to interview superintendents. And the reason for this is that in Virginia, and this is not the case in every state, but in Virginia at least, you don't have to announce who you're interviewing for superintendency. But if you give notice of dates and times when those interviews are going to happen, then people are going to stand outside the meeting room, see who goes in and out of it, and know who you're interviewing. So this gives you the opportunity to create this 15-day window to do your superintendent interviews. And it's usually scheduling reasons, if you can't get them all done within that 15 days, you have to start over, have another meeting, announce another 15-day window. And like I say, a lot of individual board members will never need this, depending on when your term corresponds with your superintendent's term. But so this is one of those things, just kind of file it away in the back of your minds in case it ever does come into play. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about agendas. FOIA requires is that at least one copy of your proposed agenda and agenda packet has to be made available to the public at the same time the documents are furnished to members of the school board. This is a separate requirement from giving notice of the meetings. And especially if you give notice of your meeting schedule, way in advance, you're not going to have the agenda packet ready. But once it has to be available to the public at the same time it's available to board members. And I want to comment, this slide I wrote rather carefully. It says copy of the proposed agenda and agenda packet. We all know agenda packets change, but the proposed agenda. Does your board adopt the agenda at the beginning of each meeting?
Yes.
Okay, all right, good. I wanted to make sure. There are a few boards that don't. It makes sense to adopt it at the beginning of each meeting, but I didn't want to make any assumptions.
I just had just a curious question.
Sure,
How
go
did
ahead.
they do that back in the day? Before now we have board docs where everybody can see the agenda. What did we used to do?
Board office.
Well, Tracy, I don't know what you used to do, but what a lot of boards used to do was they would make the stack of documents, however thick it was. Say they were making 5 of them. Well, you probably made more than 5, but 5 for the board members plus a couple, for whoever else on staff got them. They'd make an extra one, have it available at the clerk's desk, because the rule is make it available, not actually distribute it. And they would have it sitting someplace that was accessible so that the local newspaper or whoever would,
Okay.
and I think that happened on a pretty regular basis. The local newspaper reporter or TV reporter who covered board meetings would know, this is probably going to be ready at 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoon, and they would just come by and take a look at it.
Okay, thank you. Makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
I
No,
should know
actually,
that. I mean, I am not one of these young people up here on the board. I should have known that. I guess I'm not one that went and got one.
Elizabeth, also prior to technology, there were some governmental organizations that actually would post it at public libraries as well for the public to view.
I did not know that, but that kind of makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. And I don't know if you know this, but at one time, the law actually required that school boards make copies of their policy manuals available at every public
Right.
I
library.
remember those days. I mean, that thing was that
Yeah.
thick.
Yes. And it was usually the clerk who had to drive around to the public libraries in the county to update them. And I think a lot of clerks were thrilled when they didn't have to do that, and boards, because it's time consuming to keep those up to date. And yeah, I remember, like I've been at VSBA for 20 years. It's probably only been 10 years that the policy manual wasn't required to be at every public library. So sometimes technology does make life much easier.
Definitely.
The law does not require, the law doesn't include anything that says how your agenda gets done, how you prepare it, but it's really a practical necessity. So VSBA does do a sample policy on that. Ours is basically based on Robert's Rules of Order because, Robert thinks about this all the time. And what it says is that the proposed agenda is prepared by the chair with the assistance of the superintendent. And like I say, that comes from Roberts, and it's just based on logic. Somebody needs to kind of coalesce all of the things that have been proposed, figure out how much you can get done at any given meeting, prioritize what is highest priority, what staff isn't really ready to brief you on yet, and I know part of the agendas is not just planning the upcoming meetings, but also the next several and logistically figuring out what to do to keep your meetings a manageable length, but still get your get everything done, or at least make progress on everything. Okay, I'm going to start talking about closed sessions. And currently, Virginia law, I think, has about 50 exceptions for what you can discuss in closed session. One thing I want to mention, I get calls from board members periodically who say that they had a closed session, they met in closed session, and they'll say something along the lines of, "We started in closed session." And I always have to listen very carefully. It's just a terminology thing, but you might want to be careful to make sure you don't say something like that, because there is no such thing as a standalone closed session. You have to open, the board has to open its meeting in open session. Somebody has to make the motion, and then you go into closed session. So even if everybody knows it's a student discipline matter, and that's all that you're going to be talking about at that particular meeting, the vast majority of the meeting is going to be devoted to the closed session, but there's still going to be that little bit of open session at the beginning and at the end. So just remember, you don't want your public hearing, you say, well, we met in closed session and decided. That's how that sentence usually ends. You don't decide anything in closed session. You might discuss it, but you don't decide it until you come back out and take the vote. So I know that for closed sessions are one of the main things you wanted to talk about, and here we are an hour and a half into this, and we're finally getting to it. What FOIA requires on motions to go into closed session is that the motions have to have 3 things in them. They have to cite the applicable legal provision, which 99 times out of 100 is a subsection of the Freedom of Information Act. And the motion also has to identify the subject matter that's going to be discussed and state the purpose of the closed meeting. When I do this, when I talk about this live in the orientations, when I'm talking about the difference between the subject and the purpose, that's when people's eyes glaze over. And I understand that. And, Zoom is good, but between the masks and everything else, I can't tell. If your eyes are glazing over, I'm just going to assume that they are, and that let's talk a little bit more about the difference between the subject and the purpose. And the way I remember this is a word game, essentially. And I always remember that the subject is a bit more specific and that the purpose can be satisfied, the purpose requirement can be satisfied by paraphrasing the exception, the legal exception. So purpose is paraphrase, subject is specific, S's and P's. The subject is defined as being specific, but not so specific that you give away every detail of what's going to be talked about in the closed session. So there's got to be some specificity, but not every detail. And the purpose, again, has to be, or can be satisfied with the exception. So, best way, I think, to talk about this is by some examples. And just the nature of the beast, how not to examples are easier than how to examples. So I'm going to start with how not to examples. First one, a motion that would say, I move to go into closed session to discuss personnel. That does not meet the requirements of the Freedom of Information Act. Can anybody tell me what's wrong with it or what it's missing?
Well, it doesn't have the citation.
That's the biggie. It also doesn't have a subject.
Yeah, it's not the specific.
It's not specific.
Yeah, saying to discuss personnel, that probably is sufficient as a purpose, but because it does not have a citation or a subject, the motion as a whole is not sufficient. Here's another one. Motion to go into closed session. What's wrong with that one?
It's got nothing. It's got no subject, no purpose, no it's got literally nothing, no information.
Exactly. It fails on all three counts. And here's another one. Motion to go into closed session pursuant to FOIA.
Again, nothing.
Yes. And the reason I added this one is because FOIA explicitly says that the citation has to be to a specific section of law, and a generalized reference to FOIA is not sufficient. So this one tries to use a generalized reference to the Freedom of Information Act, and it fails. That is not sufficient. Okay, here's one that is sufficient. And I made this up, so it's just my example. I moved to go into that Wight County School Board go into closed session pursuant to Virginia Code 2.2, that's 3711A1. It always has to be the subsection of a statute. Just saying 3711 would not be sufficient. To discuss disciplinary action against an employee. The citation is pretty obvious. It refers to employee matters, so that paraphrases the personnel exception, and it mentions discipline. So that is the subject. Discipline is a little more specific than just a generalized reference to employee matters or personnel matters. So I know that this is one of the topics that you guys really wanted to kind of hone in on. So what I'm going to do is ask if you've got generalized questions, and then I'm hoping to have you guys actually, somebody, give me a hypothetical situation and have you all draft some sample motions. So, anybody, first of all, anybody got any questions generally on these three requirements?
No, I think we have become rather knowledgeable about this. We all know about the three aspects of a motion to go in closed session now, but this is something that did get us in a little trouble. Our motions to go into closed session were not detailed enough. So we had to learn a lot before this meeting because well, I won't go any further than that, but
I've read the FOIA Council opinion.
Pardon?
I've read the FOIA Council opinion.
She read it. Actually, may I say something, Madam Chair?
Sure.
Actually, Elizabeth, this Wight County Board, School Board, they have pretty much been following the codes as far as the reasons for going into closed session, and our motions have been fine. But FOIA updated some things. And I think because of other school systems maybe having some controversy about, explaining why they were going into closed session, that there were some local people here decided to attack us as well. But it wasn't like we had some of the motions that example motions that you gave not to do. We've never had those. We've always had a subject, purpose, and site, everything. But there are some, we do have some citizens want to know every detail. Like they want us, I think, to write out every little detail, every little name and everything. And that's what they wanted.
I don't think there were any red flags that went up for us because we were hearing what we had always heard in past school board meetings for years. So we didn't realize that we weren't being as detailed as maybe we should have been. And I think identifying the subject, purpose, and the citation, we were able to do that, but I guess we weren't as specific. We didn't have the specifics as detailed as what maybe we should have had.
I think some of those citizens wanted to know if you're going to go in there to discipline a staff, they wanted to actually attach to that the staff member was Denise Tynes, okay? And I think they wanted to see things like that, or the staff member was a teacher or whatever.
They wanted it specific enough so that they could figure out who
was who, right?
Was who.
That's it.
I think.
And that is what some members of the public are always going to want. And so there's always a whole lot of ways to make motions that are legally sufficient. And I think as board members more experienced and more comfortable drafting motions, that they just become more confident knowing that they've complied with the law, and also get a feel for how much information the board wants to have in any given motion. And different boards look at this differently. Some provide a lot more information than others. And that is something that, is local control. Different boards just put different amounts of information in. How do you guys each draft your own motions? If you're, if somebody knows that you've got,
No, we do not. We do not personally draft the motions, but we have a motion that's proposed, and then of course we have to, go with it, or we could change it. But we are presented a proposed motion to go into closed session.
Presented by whom?
The superintendent, and sometimes he will even confer with our school board attorney to make sure that it is that it would follow the FOIA laws.
Okay, so you get the proposed one from the superintendent, and who makes that motion? How do you decide who makes that motion?
Well, it is put in the school docs, like the school board docs. We can see it when we have the agenda, what the proposed motion is, and then...
The vice chair makes the motion.
Yes.
Okay, so the vice chair always makes the motion.
That's right.
That's correct. Okay, so the vice chair, do you know what's going to be discussed? I mean, do you have enough information about the underlying situation for you to evaluate whether the required information is there or not, and whether you think it's a good motion?
I do now.
Okay.
Well, the reason I said that in the past, I guess, 6 months, yes, we have had a lot of discussion and training, what needed to be in those motions. So at this point, yes, I definitely know.
Madam Chair.
Okay.
We also do an agenda review with the chairman.
Right.
before the meeting. So all of that is shared, the personnel report and everything is shared with the chairman before the actual meeting.
And who's part of that agenda review?
The superintendent, the chairman, the clerk, and the exec team from each department, whether it be instruction, facilities. We go over the entire agenda on what's going to be presented. And this is the day before it's published, and it's published to the public and the board at the same time.
I don't know if that's changed, because when I was doing board reviews, I didn't get the personnel report or any of the
No,
presentations.
we just added the personnel report due to this, to be more specific, the
No,
personnel.
I mean, when she's doing reviews, you get the personnel report and you see the presentations?
No, we get that when it's presented on
Right.
the agenda, is when
Right.
I see it
It's
first.
when, for the open session, which has salaries, the closed session is, posted. But the open session now has the personnel report posted on there.
When we publish it, but I'm saying when she does agenda review that Thursday before,
It's discussed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not handed to you or anything, but I mean, there's questions and.
There may be some
Exactly.
discussion, but I don't know that, you know,
I'm gonna say,
what,
because I never got that when I was doing it. So
Yeah,
I
that
just
was-
didn't know if that had changed, and I was just curious if it had changed, because there's a lot of presentations I didn't see until I got the information, and then the personnel report I didn't
PowerPoints.
see until it got published on board docs, when I was chair. So I didn't know if that had changed for you, if you were getting different information than I had gotten.
I think the idea for us today with what we're talking about is that the agenda to go into closed session is available to Ms. Tynes, who is going to present the motion,
Right.
the motion to go into closed session. She sees what is in the agenda for closed session, plus she has the proposed motion to go into closed session. So she does have the information to evaluate if that proposed motion does in fact meet the requirements that we now, realize the specifics that should be included.
And that's what I was trying to figure out, the mechanism of how that happens. So, Ms. Hines, are you comfortable that you have all the information you need to evaluate the proposed motion?
Yes. Actually, when I come to the meeting, the motion is there before me, and I have time prior to the meeting to read everything and make sure everything is included, okay? And if we do need to make a correction, we can pretty much correct it prior to the meeting.
Yeah, 'cause
So I
there's a
do
whole
have,
week.
I have enough
Yeah.
time,
There's a whole week.
yes.
Okay. And I don't know how you do it, but what I recommend to people is that every time they see a motion to go into closed session, they just have that mental checklist: citation, purpose, subject. And both for the person who is making the motion, but also for the chair and other board members, as a chair, if for example, which I know is not going to happen in your division, but if you heard one of these motions like move to go into closed session pursuant to FOIA, you as chair would kind of click into gear and say, Ms. Ewing, perhaps I'd like to amend that motion to include more information, or guide your board member who's making a motion that might not be as detailed as it would be. And for the other board members too, it's a good exercise for each of you when you hear those motions to just mentally click through the list: citation, is there a subsection, subject, and purpose, for a couple of reasons. One is you're voting on that motion, and you want to only vote on motions that are proper. Also, you may be the vice chair one day, and so it's a good way to get in the habit of being prepared when it comes your turn. And also, the minutes are required to set forth in detail the same information required in the motion. Every board member will be voting on the minutes, down the line, and you want to make sure that the minutes that you're going to be voting on have all the required information. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure that the information is in the motion, and then it can just kind of get carried forward into the minutes. So the flip side of that requirement is that if you do get a complaint that your motions were insufficient, or that a particular motion was insufficient, you're almost guaranteed to get a corresponding complaint that your minutes were insufficient, because, and Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong, but the minutes usually pretty much cut and paste the exact motion into the minutes. So it's just another reason that every board member should be kind of invested in making sure that the motions are sufficient. Even though only one person is making that motion, you're all voting on it, and you're all voting on that motion, and you're also all voting on the minutes down the line when you get those.
Now, I have another question I want to ask you.
Sure.
In the previous governing bodies I have served on, the attorneys made that motion. They were responsible for the motion. They made the motion to go into closed session, and the other members of that particular body, we voted on it. But our school board, our attorney is not present for our meetings unless requested. And in most cases, they're not requested. Now, so I guess that is the reason why the vice chair is responsible for the motion at this time. So my question is this a normal practice, or would you consider that being a careless type practice?
Which practice? You described two of them.
Okay, either one of them.
Okay. I'm a little surprised to hear that somebody other than a board member makes a motion.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on Robert's Rules of Order by any stretch of the imagination. I have a copy, and after this, I'll actually probably go look up whether people who are not members of the body can do that. Obviously, since you say it happens on a regular basis, it can. I'm not going to argue parliamentary procedure with people who have probably looked it up. But it does surprise me a little bit. If nothing else, for the perception that, this is your board meeting. You are the board members, and you are the ones who are going to be going into closed session. So to me, it's kind of an ownership thing. You want to own your own meetings and your own motions. And especially if you're getting legal advice when you need it on how to draft the motions, I'm not sure what would be gained by having the lawyer actually make the motion.
Okay.
But I've never heard of this until just now, so I'm kind of thinking, off the top of my head. But yeah, I'm a little surprised to hear that somebody other than a board member would make a motion for the board to go into closed session.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
See, I thought it was normal. It happens so much.
Well, that's the thing. If that's what you've seen, that's what you think is normal. And yeah, boards that have their lawyer at every meeting, sometimes the things just run differently because you've got legal counsel there. You can ask them questions, immediately. It's kind of just a different system. But and I don't know who y'all's lawyer is. I'm assuming it's somebody in a law firm as opposed to an assistant county attorney.
Yes, we have a law firm.
Okay, yeah, and a lot of boards just don't want to devote the resources to having a private lawyer at every meeting because it gets expensive. You have them there when you need them.
Thank you.
Sure. Actually, we can always come back to motions, but unless anybody else has questions on motions, I'm going to kind of move into what you talked about after the motion's been made and actually in the closed session. So first call. Any more questions on motions?
No, thank you.
Sure. I think you probably all know this, but I get questions sometimes about whether such and such a person, usually by job title, can attend a closed session. And the answer is always that the board can ask anybody that it thinks will help in its consideration of whatever you're going to be talking about in closed session. The board can ask anybody it wants to come in to closed session or to attend the closed session. There are, as you know, procedures at the end of each closed session. And those are the certification requirements. You have to certify two things. The first is that you only discussed things that were legally exempt from, legally permitted to be discussed in closed session. And the second thing is that you only discussed things that were identified in the motion. So how do you guys do your certification? Do you have kind of a proposed or prepared certification?
Yes, ma'am.
It's prepared, and we, again, the vice chair will, once we come back, and prior to going directly into open session, we'll read exactly what's here, only the matters that were exempted, and only those things that were identified. And then each board member will vote. But that's all that was discussed.
Or discussed or considered.
Okay.
Pardon me?
Or discussed or considered, right?
Right, discuss or consider.
Same thing, every meeting.
Every meeting.
Okay. And usually certifications go pretty smoothly. I don't get a whole lot of questions about those. This is a new provision of law. It went into effect, I think, about 18 months ago. And school boards, public bodies are potentially subject to a civil penalty of up to $1,000 if a court finds, and I'm going to come back to that, if a court finds that the school board's vote to certify the closed session did not comply with FOIA. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that this is new is, one is you might not have heard of it, but also no court has imposed this. This has never come up in litigation. And so I can't tell you exactly what a court would require to find that a public body certification was not in compliance with FOIA. But I can tell you, you don't want to be the test case. So just be aware of this. If for nothing else, you may have members of the public essentially threatening you with it. I don't want you to be surprised if you've got a member of the public who says, if you don't do this right, you're going to have to pay $1,000.
Yeah, we got one or two.
Referring
She
to.
didn't hear that. I said,
They're
we
out there.
We have one or two.
I know.
So
And
if this,
I tell every school board, just don't be the test case. The other thing to point out here is the language that says if a court finds that the certification was insufficient. So the reason that's important is it would have to get to that point in litigation for a court to actually make that finding. So it's not just when a member of your public claims that your certification was insufficient. It's only, this would only come into play if and when you get to that point in litigation.
Ms. Perkins had a question.
my question is.
Sure, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If this was just recently added, this penalty, what precipitated the adding of this particular section?
You know, that's a good question, and I don't know. I'll just leave it there. I don't know if there was a situation that this might have come into play in if it had been in effect. But it was added at the same time or close to the same time that the requirement for mandatory training for elected public officials went in, and there were a couple of other changes to FOIA about the same time. So even my guess would be, if there wasn't a particular situation involving a certification, it might have been just one part of a more general movement to kind of beef up the enforcement of FOIA generally. Sometimes when FOIA gets tweaked, I call Alan Bernhardt and ask him, like I did with the language on approving remote participation equally. I didn't call him and ask him about this one, so I don't.
Alan Burkhart.
Gerhard.
Oh, Dearheart, I can say.
Earhart.
Thank you, Lynn. No, I just wanted to clarify a name you just mentioned because it sounded like one of our locals, okay?
Oh. I don't know if you guys remember Pat Lacey. He represented a lot of school boards across the state. And there was a bill, probably at least 10 years ago now, that requires school boards to, if you have a family that has twins, and school boards usually were pretty good with working with families of twins, especially in elementary schools, to decide whether those twins were in the same, say, third grade class or separate classes. And, depending on the family, depended on the decision. But there's a law that now requires that parents of twins or higher order multiples, so twins, triplets, whatever, to have input into that decision. And I called Pat Lacey and I said, where did this come from? Why do we have a law on this? And he said, because there was one situation, in one part of the state, and the parents went to their legislator, and so now we have a law. And I think that's the explanation for a lot of laws that at first blush you kind of think, do we really need this? And sometimes that's just the way democracy works. Somebody gets upset enough about something and takes it to their legislator, and we end up with a law. Okay, I think everybody knows you have to take minutes at all open meetings. I don't get a whole lot of questions about minutes, but when I do, they honestly usually involve situations where they're after the fact and board members haven't paid particular attention to what they were voting to approve, which kind of makes sense because minutes are usually a part of the consent agenda. Is that how you guys do yours?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, they're the consent agenda. The reason things are in the consent agenda is because they're probably not going to be controversial. So you may not pay as much attention to them as you pay to other things. But occasionally I do get questions after the fact from somebody who will call, a board member who will call and say, I meant to say XYZ, and that's not accurate. And I always say, well, have the minutes been approved? And the answer is always yes. There's nobody beforehand. And at that point, you can still change minutes. It's a parliamentary procedure motion called a motion to amend something previously done. But it's kind of burdensome, and it's kind of a pain in the neck. And it's much easier to just make sure they're right the first time. So even though reading minutes is not the most exciting thing in the world, just remember that they are the official record of what your board did. And, you all may remember next year what you did, but 15, 20 years down the line, you're probably not going to be on the board. Staff probably will have turned over, but those minutes are still going to be around, and they're going to be an important record for whoever comes next to know what your board did. So I always encourage people who are writing minutes and voting on minutes to keep that in mind. Are the minutes clear, not to people who know what was done, but are they going to be clear to people who read them with a question about, okay, did we vote to, for example, approve a new school, or did we vote to approve to build a new school at such and such a location? And that can be, this is kind of sort of a real life example. That's a very big difference. So just kind of keep it in mind as you are voting to approve minutes, that the whole goal is that they should speak to audiences who don't have a whole lot of background or other information. Going the wrong way again. Sorry about that. Minutes are not required closed sessions. I know some boards do take minutes in closed session. Do you guys do that?
No, we do not do
Okay,
minutes
all
at
right.
closed sessions.
And that's fine. Minutes are also not required at committee meetings unless a membership of the committee includes a majority of the board. So, do y'all have student discipline committees are usually the type of committee I get the most questions about. Do y'all do expulsions and long-term suspensions by a discipline committee, or does the whole board do those?
A three-person committee.
Okay. So that is, and it's 3 members, so that's a majority of the board, so this would come into play for that kind of.
And those do have minutes when
Yes, they
they
do.
happen.
But the kids haven't been
I'm
to
not
school,
surprised,
so we
but-
haven't had to have a disciplinary committee.
It's nice.
I'm sorry, somebody have a question?
Oh, no, I just made the comment, the students have not been in school full-time, so we don't have any disciplinary meetings right now.
I'm hearing that a lot.
They're all
that,
been very, what they say, proactive.
Yeah, the pandemic creates more work in a lot of ways, but less work on some fronts. Okay, minutes are required to be in writing, obvious. They have to include the date, time, and location of the meeting. You have to list members who were present and absent. They have to include a summary of the items discussed. And that is something I do get questions about. People ask me, well, what do you mean by a summary? And lots of ways to summarize anything. Some board members, especially historically, have wanted, actually some board members and members of the public, have wanted essentially a verbatim transcript of everything they say to be reflected in the minutes. And, that's certainly one way to go about it, but it's much more efficient to include a summary. The other situation where this comes into play is members of the public who speak at public comment, and some members of the public want every word they say to be included. That's an option. I've actually seen public comment summarized in kind of a lot of ways. Everything from a lot of detail to situations where, say you've got a hotly contested topic, building school. I've seen a summary that, and say you had 20 people speaking at public comment about building that school. It might have been a list of, these 10 people spoke in favor of building the school, these 10 people spoke in opposition. And that is a summary. That's fine. So how much detail you want between those 2 points is up to the board. And as long as your board is good with the amount of detail, that's what matters. Board members can factor in public opinion, but it's ultimately a board decision. And since the board is the body that approves the minutes, obviously you would work with your superintendent and with Tracy ahead of time, but you can always just let people know whether you are comfortable with the amount of detail that's there for that summary.
The motion to go into closed session, should that be recorded verbatim as made?
Yes.
Okay. So that's why now we have a proposed written motion on the agenda that all school board members have before them. So that makes it easier for those that are doing the minutes. If we use that motion, it really helps the Tracy and Jessica doing the minutes. If there's any reason you don't want to use that proposed motion, then that's fine too. You just have to make sure that your motion is clearly stated and give them time to record the motion as well.
Yeah, and yeah, whenever somebody's making a motion, whether it's a closed session motion that you kind of have some advance notice of, or if it's something that comes up more on the spur of the moment and the motion is being made without preparation. I've watched board meetings where the person who's making the motion essentially looks at the chair and the clerk and kind of pauses and says, "Did you get that?" And there's nothing wrong with that either. And especially if the vice chair is, for whatever reason, deviating from the proposed closed session motion, yeah, there's nothing wrong with kind of pausing and saying, you know, "Did you get that?" I don't know if y'all record meetings, but even if the meeting is recorded, sometimes it's just easier to clarify it live rather than making Tracy or whoever go back and listen to the recording.
We record our meetings.
And it's also not a bad idea to clarify it. You know, the other board members may want to hear it again too. So, but yeah, the exact language of motions to go into closed session should be in the minutes.
All of our meetings are recorded.
Okay. I'm not surprised. You know, 15 years ago, nobody recorded their meetings. Now I think pretty much everybody does. On the requirement that a record of any votes taken, that should also include information if you have a situation where a board member either gets to the meeting late or leaves early or for some reason has to, you know, step aside for a few minutes and does not vote on any particular item, that also needs to be reflected. I know a lot of boards do their minutes, you know, there's a vote on such and such a topic, and it will just say approved unanimously. And that's absolutely fine as long as all the board members who were at the meeting were there for the whole time. But if you have somebody who, for whatever reason, has to come or go or not vote on a particular topic, you have to specify who voted on what and which way they voted. And again, it's for people reading this down the line who don't know that somebody had to step away or wasn't there. I used to get a lot of questions about this. I haven't in years, but I still like to mention it. And I think the reason I don't get these questions now is because FOIA actually has been changed. But draft minutes are public records. At one point, I think people thought minutes were not public records until they had been approved. That is not the case. So as soon as your minutes as soon as there's a draft of your minutes, they're a public record, and if somebody asks for them, they can have them. Now they can be stamped with draft all over them, and the whole point of drafts of anything is that they are probably going to be changed before they are finalized. So if you've got somebody who asks for a draft, that's fine, give them a draft. That does not mean that that's the final version. Okay, I think this might be a good time to take just, say, a 5-10 minute break to let people kind of check their email, and I'm going to refill my tea, and y'all can get your caffeine or whatever, whatever you might be drinking. So, like I said, let's plan to start back up in 10 minutes. Just a quick break to let everybody move around a little bit, and then we will get back to work.
Okay, so it's 11:10 now. You want to resume at 11:20?
Yes, that sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Tracy, how can I get your
Okay,
background?
thanks.
It's getting cold in here.
How can I get
I
a
don't have
background like
sweaters.
yours?
7:20, so we're going to go ahead and resume the training.
Thank you. Hope everybody got up to date on their emails and everything else you had to check and have added to your to-do list for later this afternoon.
And thank you for that break. It was needed.
I understand. Long Zoom meetings are just tough. And so, yes, thank you. Glad you appreciated it. Before the break, we were talking about meetings. And so now I'm going to switch to the other part of FOIA, which is the public records part. But I'll give you one more chance, and this will be the last chance. But anything anybody wants to follow up on about meetings before I start talking about records? Go ahead. Anybody got any meetings questions?
Anyone? No, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Records. We are going to start at the same place, but I'm not going to go back to the slides. Just a reminder that the general rule is that all public records, so all records of the school board, are open to the public. And that is about as broad a statement, broad a rule as there can possibly be. But that is the FOIA rule. So when I say all records are open to the public, that brings up the question, well, just what is a record? And FOIA has a definition of records. It is as broad as it can possibly be. Records involve both traditional pieces of paper and Excel spreadsheets and things like that. They also involve much more modern things like text messages and social media posts and things like that. But basically, if it is written down or documented, I guess is a better word, in any way, shape, or form, and it belongs
This is an open door meeting.
Are y'all?
We're good.
We have a situation where someone closed our doors, and this is a public meeting, so we have to open them back up.
Oh, okay. We're seeing the screen or something. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Basically, if board members or school board employees have anything, and it pertains to school board business, it is a public record. And that's the starting point on public records for FOIA. Obviously, board members have a lot of records, but so do your employees. And that's not just the superintendent and the clerk and your HR director or your FOIA officer. Bus drivers might have lists of which kids are on which run, things like that. Now, that's a bad example because that would probably be a student record, but the number of public records held by any particular school board is just amazing. But the mindset needs to be, keep in mind that if it is documented in any way, shape, or form, and board members or staff members have it, it is a public record subject to FOIA. When you get a FOIA request, and Lynn, I take it those come to you, is that the process for your division? Okay.
Yes.
Then Lynn will be the one handling making the responses. And the Freedom of Information Act actually mandates the possible responses. And there are 5 of them, I think. The first one is, thank you for asking, here's the document you're asking for. That's the easiest one. The others are a bit more nuanced depending on what you are doing. So, for example, if you don't have the record that's being requested, you tell the person making the request, we don't have it. But if you know, for example, that another public body does, say your Board of Supervisors does, then you have to share that information. We don't have it, but here's who probably does and who's their contact information. If the record that's being requested is something that you have, but it falls under one of the exceptions, then you have to tell the person who's making the request that. And you have to do it with some specificity. So, for example, if it's a student record, the response would be, yes, we have it, but it is exempt from mandatory disclosure pursuant to, and you give the citation. So those responses all have to be made within 5 days, 5 working days. And, you know, on the one hand, if what they're asking for is the minutes of the last meeting, 5 days is plenty. You know, Lynn or Tracy has that pretty much at their fingertips. The reason that FOIA sometimes can be stressful for school divisions is that if you aren't sure, or somebody is going to have to do a lot of looking to find out if you've got a record, that's when the 5-day deadline can get a little more interesting, especially if it's a request it's not particularly clear, or a request that covers a whole lot of documents. And when I say a request that isn't particularly clear, that's actually a pretty common situation. And Lynn, come in here in case your experience has been different, but a lot of divisions get requests from people who request a document that they assume the board has, that you might not, or that asks for a document by name that isn't actually the document that has been given to it by the board. So a lot of times the first step once you get a request is not filling it, but figuring out what the requester is actually asking for. A lot of times that involves back and forth, you know, picking up the phone or somehow communicating with the person who's making the request to find out exactly what it is they're looking for. And that may seem kind of counterintuitive, but it also can greatly increase efficiency. I've seen situations, for example, where a member of the public will request all of the chair of the Isle of Wight County School Board. And the person who's making the request is probably only interested in the current chair's emails, might only be interested in the emails pertaining to a particular issue. But the way the request is written is all emails from the chair. So if you've, you know, I don't know how long email's been around, 30 years, you know, so that would be 30 years of emails for every chair who's ever served on your school board. And if your FOIA officer can pick up the phone and say, do you want these going back how many years, or just the current chair? A lot of times the requester is actually happy to clarify that because they don't want to read 30 years worth of emails. They also want to pay for 30 years worth of emails. So if a request comes in that's not clear, or that you think, you know, depending on the situation, you might just know that they're looking for something and not expressing it well, that can get clarified and save board staff a lot of work, save the person who's making the request a lot of money. And I realize here, I'm assuming that you guys charge for FOIA requests. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes.
Okay. Most divisions do. I have heard that there are a few who do, well, I should say at least at one time, who did not, because they got so few of them, it was easier not to have a system. But I think most divisions do. So good to know that you guys are in that majority. And obviously, these are the kinds of things that staff would handle. Not that Lynn has time on her hands, but there is some efficiencies to be involved by having the same person handle all FOIA requests. So just because you get used to how to write the responses if you are not giving the particular document, if you've got it but aren't producing it. Also, it's a really good way by having all the requests come to one person. It may give the division a heads up that there's an issue brewing. It also can build in some efficiencies. If you get the same request from 5 different people for the same document, and it took 2 days to find it the first time around, it's not going to take 2 days signed it the second time around. So even before the law required divisions to have somebody who was entitled FOIA officer, I think a lot of divisions had a de facto FOIA officer who did all the things that the FOIA officer does now. And also, reasons I'm talking about this is just to reiterate that it's not the role of board members to try to respond to requests for information. It's much more efficient for it to be handled by that person, and that's why you have the FOIA officer. Just like with meetings, there are exceptions to records, to the records part of FOIA. And the exceptions establish which records are subject to mandatory disclosure. The list, I'm not sure exactly how long it is right now, probably about 50 things on the list of exceptions. And as with the meetings, some of those are records for specific types of governmental entities that you will never have to deal with. But there are some exceptions that boards deal with on a pretty regular basis. Specifically, records for student records, employee records, maybe legal advice, some negotiating records like financial proposals that you may be able to not produce when producing them would hit you in your negotiating strategy. There's things like that. Do you guys get a lot of FOIA requests that become contentious?
Not a lot. We get some that are rather lengthy.
Okay.
We get some that tend to mix requests for documents with requests for answers versus a document. But for the most part, they've been manageable.
Okay. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned the difference between requests for records and the requests for answers, because that's something that a lot of people who make requests don't understand. FOIA applies to public records, and there has to be a record. But a lot of people think, and FOIA does not require a public body to create a record. So if they are looking for information that, say your superintendent might have in head but has not written down anywhere, that's not a public record. If you're not required to create a public record, so he's not required to sit down and write it all out. Now, there may be times for public relations reasons or other reasons like that, in my example, a superintendent might then want to have a conversation with whoever was asking for that information. And that's fine, but it's not required by FOIA. Now, explaining that to a person who's making the request might require a little finesse depending on the person's sophistication level and whether anybody actually has the information or not. But it's not technically speaking a FOIA issue. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm not surprised that requests for information come in not clearly delineated whether it's a request for a record or not. One thing that always surprises me when I'm talking to a board member, even occasionally from clerks, they'll say, well, somebody asked me for this and such, but it wasn't a FOIA request. And I always listen to them talk, and then say, well, if it wasn't a FOIA request, what was it? And sometimes the response is, well, they just wanted to know, which, you know, if they're asking for information, then I guess it's not a FOIA request because they weren't asking for a record, but that's not really what they mean. What they usually mean is that the person didn't say, I am making a FOIA request. And they don't have to say, I am making a FOIA request. Any request for records falls under the Freedom of Information Act. And that is true whether the person kind of knows the system and goes straight to Lynn, or whether it's somebody who maybe has never even heard of the Freedom of Information Act and is going straight to a board member. So anytime board members or staff people get a request for a public record, I think I understand your system is it goes straight to Lynn. In some divisions, it would go to the superintendent and then go to the FOIA officer. But whatever the system is, when you as board members get a request for records or information, if it's for records, it goes to Lynn. If it's a request for information, what is the system for that? Does that go to Lynn too? Or have you never thought about it?
What was the question?
Could you repeat that question again? It was kind of
Sure. When a board member gets a request for a record or information, when a community member just says, hey, I want to know X, Y, Z, what is the system for responding to that?
We don't get that many. Most of our requests goes to the clerk because the chair would normally make the announcement within our meetings that if you want any record or if you want to know anything, to check with the clerk. And I guess our clerk will direct them to Ms. Briggs, the FOIA officer.
Okay.
And I have had them presented to me before, and then I would forward them to Lynn.
Okay. The reason I'm bringing this up is in some divisions, board members relatively frequently are asked for information. And in some divisions, board members provide that information, which can get complicated for a lot of reasons. So I'm glad to hear that y'all's system is to fund things to clerk or the FOIA officer so that the responses can be handled pursuant to FOIA, or if it's a request for information that's not contained in a record, to at least handle it in a consistent way. This I know you guys already have covered because she's here. Every board member should know who your officer is and what your FOIA procedures are, and I can tell from this conversation that you do. So that's great. I'm sorry to say not every board can say that. And again, I've already touched on this, but board members, it's not the role of board members or even individual staff people to respond to requests for records. They all need to get funneled through the FOIA officer because that's why you have a FOIA officer. And also just to make sure that the responses that are given are in line with what is required by law. When I do orientation training, I always get questions about email. And at first, that didn't surprise me at all when email was new. People wanted to argue that email wasn't a record, and that argument does not fly anymore, if it ever did. But certainly it doesn't fly now. There have been court cases and FOIA opinions that make it very clear that emails, whether you print them out and have a hard copy of them or not, that they are records for FOIA purposes. And I think probably emails are one of the most requested types of records that school boards get requests for. So if and when you get a request for emails, either from all board members or a particular board member for usually, hopefully, a specified period of time. Not only your FOIA officer, well, your FOIA officer will usually end up working with your tech people to actually get those emails so that you can respond to that. Now, what you're looking at on the slide is a best practice. It is not currently required by law. Please use your school board email account for all school board related messages.
I have a question.
Sure.
I think I want to clarify. If we get any emails sent to, for instance, if I get an email sent to me by a citizen concerning a school item, which we got a lot of them about the opening and the closing of schools this year, are you saying we need to make copies of them, or we need to just keep them where they are? Because I didn't delete them. They're there. They're still there.
Are these messages sent to your school board email account or to a personal email account?
They're sent school board email account.
Okay. Then your IT people should be able to access those if and when they are ever requested.
Okay.
That's one of the critical reasons for doing all the school board emailing on your school board email account, because that way they're housed on the school board servers,
right.
And you don't have to go, I don't know, Gmail or Yahoo or whoever would have your personal records if and when you get a FOIA request.
So we can just leave it there. And in some situations when I get them, and if I know it's something that needed to have gone to the superintendent, I just forward it to the superintendent. It's really not particularly a board item per se. It's something dealing directly with instructional. I just send it to the superintendent.
And that makes perfect sense. And actually, if you had said that these were coming to a personal email account, what I was going to recommend is essentially the same system. You can always forward something like that to your school board email account,
Okay.
which then will preserve it just like it had gone there originally.
Okay.
So, but I'm glad to hear that your constituents, at least to this point, are emailing you on your school board email account. That makes life much easier for everybody because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a 5-day time limit to respond to FOIA requests. And if a school board member is using a personal account, that 5 days can go very quickly when your tech people have to get access to your personal email account and then go looking for the records that might be responsive to the specific request.
Elizabeth, can I ask a question, please? This is Lynn.
Of course.
So, regarding emails, if, say, there was a FOIA request for board emails related to the reopening of schools, any emails that came in from constituents would be part of that request, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
That might be a situation where you want to pick up the phone and ask for clarification. If for some reason you think that the person who's asking the question, maybe from other things that are stated in the email, or if they've made statements of public comment, if you have some reason to think that that despite what their request clearly said, that what they really wanted was between board members, you could ask. If they say no, I want anything related, then that's fine. But you could at least ask, because in that situation, I would imagine that there are, in a lot of divisions, there would be hundreds of emails from constituents and relatively few between board members. So,
but those
you
aren't
could ask.
right. Those aren't protected from FOIA release.
Protected because, well, on what basis?
I guess, I mean, those would be considered FOIA records if a board member has an email from a constituent and would be in response to a FOIA request. It's not just because it didn't come from the board member, it was sent to the board member, so that would be a record we would release.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. Back to, I'm not going to flip back, but the slide that has the definition of records,
Right.
one of the things that is included in that definition is any document that is in possession of a board member or staff person. And once that email has been received, so once it's in your inbox, I guess, that is in possession of the school board member. And I've actually seen automatic reply messages on emails that say, this is just a reminder that if you send an email to this address, it is FOIA-able. At that point, the person's already got it, and, it is already FOIA-able.
Fact, yeah.
I think, some public officials think that they want to do that just to remind people. And the times I've seen that potentially get interesting is when a parent, say a community member, emails something that they probably do not want spread widely throughout the community and puts it in an email to a board member. Well, it's in the email. Unless it falls under one of the exceptions, it's FOIA-able. If you get an email, or if you get a request for, all emails to such and such board member, you're going to have to release it. And, that goes with the territory. Somebody is writing to a public official, then what they write is a public record.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions
Emails that's not.
about that? Okay. I also want to mention this, and it's one of those situations where I hope no school board is ever the test case for this. Just a reminder that simultaneous interaction between board members by email or text or any other means of communication could be a meeting. And when I say could be, the reason I say could be is because the Virginia Supreme Court has taken a couple of cases, or I should say has considered a couple of cases in which the issue was a particular interaction between public officials on the same board. Did that amount to a meeting? And what the Supreme Court has said is that when that communication is simultaneous, that would be a meeting. What they have not said is that they have seen a factual situation in which the interaction was simultaneous. So we, in Virginia, do not know exactly how fast the interaction or the responses would have to be. And because of that, some boards have norms or protocols that talk about the use of email in various situations. So I'm just bringing this up as a reminder that even though email usually comes up under the topic of FOIA with response or with regard to records, there's also the possibility it could come up under FOIA as a meeting issue. So and I'm not saying you should do this right here and now, but just for purposes of my understanding, does your board communicate via email? Do you have norms and protocols about the use of email, or is it something you haven't really thought about?
Usually we get 2x2, or then one person will get a one-person email. If there's just like an update, like if there's a medical issue with a school or a plumbing issue or a small fire. But yeah, usually it's a 2-on-2 thing, so even if someone does hit reply, you're still with the minority of the group. And then we get one-on-one calls occasionally if there's a bigger issue we need to be updated on. But it's very rare I see something with all of us on it.
Okay, and that's great. I brought it up in case you were having questions or in case it was possibly an issue for your board, but I'm glad to hear it is not. So just be aware of it, and again, stay away from it. Sounds like you pretty much do that, because again, it's something you don't want to be past-paced for. And I'm actually getting very close to the end of the things I wanted to talk about, so I'm going to open it up to you guys. But I just wanted to recap briefly the things that the superintendent had asked me to talk about. Post-session motions, access to public records, and transparency generally. It's a starting point for your questions. Do you have any questions on any of those things? And more generally, of course, if you've got any questions at all, now is the time to mention them.
Does anyone have any specific questions?
I have one. Elizabeth, well, I know it's not a whole lot we can do when you get citizens that will send you emails sometime that is not related to the school board. They're just out there, but they're using the school board address to send it to you. It's not a personal or private, it's not my personal email, it's the school board's email.
When you say, what can you do about it?
Well, let me ask you this question. Is it possible that you could, like, I know personally, if you start getting things like that, you can block the person.
Oh.
But is it legal to block them if they're using your school board address?
On what basis would you block them? I mean, I'm not understanding why. Is it the volume of emails? Or?
They're just emails that doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing as business out of Wight County Schools.
No, you can't block somebody for that.
All right. I just wanted to know.
Okay.
But I can't put them on a timeout, right?
You could put them in your junk. You could send them to your junk folder.
Okay.
That's a personal preference, but you'd still be getting the emails, and you could check the junk folder if you wanted to.
Okay.
To
Thank
check
you.
on it.
Sure. Anybody else?
You've done a great job of,
Thank you very much.
yeah, I really appreciate your doing this, very informative. I feel like, we've had some challenges with FOIA, but through the challenges, we have grown.
Yes.
And, I mean, it's been a good outcome through it all. I think we all can say we have grown tremendously. We've learned a lot, and we learn from mistakes, and so that is a positive through all the challenges that we have experienced.
Well, and I'm thrilled to see that your board is still looking to learn more about the Freedom of Information Act and board governance generally. It's always great to see a board that is, because heaven knows your time commitment for your board service is huge to begin with. So for you guys to be willing to take this time to specifically focus on FOIA and learn even more about it, I commend you for doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I
For asking us to do it.
I also want to thank you and FOIA, the whole FOIA employees, for the information that's available to us. We can go online and get a lot of information, and I have done so. And so I just wanted to say thank you for that as well.
Well, I appreciate that, and I talked to Alan Gernhardt often enough that I will speak for him on this. That is part part of the mission of the FOIA Council is to get information out there. And I know I talk to Alan and other people at FOIA Council on a pretty regular basis, and they are always very willing to help. Alan, before Alan was the executive director there, the executive director was a woman by the name of Maria Everett, who likes to say that people tend to think of the FOIA Council as the FOIA cops, but they are actually so much broader than that. And it's to share information, to help the public understand what their rights are under FOIA, which sometimes they think their rights under FOIA are broader than they actually are. Also, on the flip side, to help public officials understand what FOIA requires of them. So it's their mission is to a large extent an educational one, as opposed to a traffic cop one. But like I said at the beginning of this, I answer a lot of questions about FOIA day in and day out. And I'm always happy to do it. I'm always still learning things about FOIA. And as different issues pop up, different aspects of FOIA come into play. So I encourage each and every one of you, if you have follow-up questions, because I don't know about you all, but I tend to think after presentations, gee, I wish I'd asked this, or I wish I'd asked that. Call me. I think everybody knows the VSBA phone number, but I'll show it up there. Actually, I did want to mention the FOIA guides, which is on our website. I like to think of it as kind of the footnotes version of FOIA. The document itself is long, but that is because the vast majority of it is FOIA. It's the language of the act. The first, I don't know, 15 pages is commentary that focuses on the parts of FOIA that does apply more frequently to school boards, the parts that you all would come into contact with on a regular basis. So don't forget about that. It's on our website. And I know we're actually finishing this a little bit earlier than we had scheduled, but I also know you guys have another meeting today. So I'm thinking that if we've covered what you want to cover, then great.
You did an excellent job, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Put it this way.
Thank you.
I'm not an expert, and I never will be an expert, and I'm not trying to take your job. But if I had to leave here today and you say, hey, I need you to go to a neighboring school board and present what you just did with us, I'll feel comfortable in doing some of those things. Versus the way I felt when I entered the meeting today.
Well, then that is a successful meeting, then. Keep saying that.
All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You have a blessed day, and you may get some emails from us here and there asking specific questions as they may pertain to particulars that may come up. But we thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Too. Bye-bye.
Bye. That's it.
Meeting adjourned.
Goodbye.
Getting ready to do. Okay, if there's no other questions with that, we are going to adjourn the meeting. Meeting is adjourned.
That woke me up.